This is The Origins of Humankind by On Humans and Carter, with your host, Ilari Mäkinen. And this is episode 2 in this 5-part series where we've assembled the world's leading experts to tell the epic story of where we all come from. It's my sincere hope that you enjoy it, that you learn something new from it, and perhaps that it can even bring a little glimmer of hope about our shared humanity within the day-to-day life of ongoing divisions. Don't worry if you haven't listened to episode 1. Each episode will stand on its own. But in episode 1, we looked at the big picture of where humans fit in the planetary story of life on Earth. Today, we're going to start zooming into particular chapters, starting from the first misty epoch, from the time when we shared an ancestor with chimpanzees, all the way to the first stone tools. That is a time that it features a huge amount of species, often called Australopithecine this and that, or Paranthropus this and that. And we're not going to go into many of these Latin names today. Instead, we're going to try to zoom out and see what are some generalizations that we can say about this mythical time, where the seeds were sown for many of our human oddities, from our language, our love of music, and even the cooling system that allows us to have this big of a brain without overheating our heads. And to guide us through it, I have Distinguished Professor of Anthropology from the University of Florida, Dean Falk, on the show. Falk is one of the world's leading experts on the evolution of the human brain, and while a lot of her work has focused in the last 3 million years of the human story, she recently turned her eyes into this early misty era in a book titled The Botanic Age, where she makes the very plausible point that, look, just because there weren't stone tools which preserve until today doesn't mean that there were no tools. There almost certainly were, but they were made of wood, they decayed, they're gone. So what, if anything, can we say about this time? Very little with absolute certainty, but there are many hints. And in the next 50 minutes or so, we will do our best in piecing together a story from the clues that we have. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, hit the subscribe button and give On Humans 5 stars if you think that it deserves that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to the show. And finally, I just want to say thank you to all my wonderful Patreon supporters. It's the end of the tax year in the UK in a couple of days, and so I just got the money that had been piling out. And it really warms my heart that now there's money on my account which has come from pure generosity of people who expect nothing in return except a couple of episodes every once in a while. So this one is for you. Thank you so much. And whoever you are, wherever you are, doing your household chores or running errands, I'm glad that you're on this journey to the very beginnings of the story of us all. This is The Origins of Humankind, with today's guest, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Dean Falk. Professor Dean Falk, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
The human family and the chimpanzee bonobo family, we don't know exactly when we split from each other, when our stories separated, but it's something around 5 to 7 million years, right? Can you take me there? What did the world look like? What do we know about this?
So around 5 to 7 million years ago, Africa was still heavily forested, but beginning to fragment. The forest cover was beginning to break up and to lessen. Our ancestors at that point, who we refer to as the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, were arboreal, living in the trees. And at the division of our ancestors from the ancestors of chimpanzees, our lineage, called hominins, began to spend more time on the ground. So we have at that point receding forests, fragmenting of the environment, and our ancestors diverge, probably because they were at the very beginning of making the transition to ground living. Their appearance would have been ape-like in terms of body proportions. Other things we can only speculate about in terms of appearance, like how much hair, skin color, that kind of thing. Cognitively, it's reasonable to assume that what chimpanzees can do today cognitively, most people are willing to say probably the common ancestor of chimps and humans had that much cognitive ability.
Yeah, and you've coined a term to describe this kind of first 3 million years or so of that journey, because the Stone Age is often, that name that you read a world history book, and in the
Yes.
beginning it says that before history there was Stone Age.
Yeah.
But before the Stone Age there was something, and the first stone tools appear kind of halfway on that
Yeah.
6+ million years. But that doesn't mean that nothing interesting was happening. It just means that we don't have things on the ground that have preserved. And so
Exactly.
you call this first 3 million years or so the Botanic Age.
Right. And you're right. The textbooks mostly focus on the Stone Age, which I put the beginning about 3.5. Actually, the oldest tools are from Kenya. They're 3.3 million, but then there are cut marks in Ethiopia on bones that are very suggestive of manufactured stone tools at 3.4. So
And I
you've
think
got
what's important, what you just mentioned there, by the way, is manufactured stone tools, because chimpanzees use stones as
yes,
tools. It's just that
exactly.
they don't make stone tools. And as Jane Goodall observed, they also do make tools, which will become, I think, which is very important for the story you're telling. It's not that chimpanzees are unable to use tools or make tools. They don't make stone tools.
Exactly. And you're right. They use them. They'll throw them at you if they want,
Yes.
crack nuts with them, but they do not deliberately batter rocks into more useful shapes, into stone tools. So that was an innovation in our own lineage about halfway through. And cognitive archaeologists and other anthropologists have really focused on the material matter in the archaeological record, and that consisted essentially of stone tools for quite a long time, and have speculated about the evolution of human intelligence based on that, as if nothing had gone before it. Certainly something was going on. And that's what the Botanic Age, that's what I speculate about, I hope reasonably, with some evidence about what went on during the Botanic Age that actually started cognitive evolution. I think it started way before there were stone tools. And as you pointed out, early hominids were, of course, making tools, as great apes do, as chimps do, and that they would have been from botanical matter. And the first tool in our sort of shared history was invented by apes, and that's arboreal sleeping nests.
Yeah, this was
They
fascinating. I learned about this from your book. I mean, because Jane Goodall, famous, I can't remember exactly what she witnessed, but it was a chimpanzee crafting some kind of a stick to fish termites. That's
exactly,
cool.
yeah,
But what you're saying is that all great apes, before they go to bed, I mean, they literally go to bed. They
yeah,
make a bed in the tree
in the trees,
to
right?
hide away, to be safe from land predators, probably.
And no monkey does that. There are hundreds of species of monkeys who are, there are only three great apes, orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. Only three great apes weave together sleeping nests, and they do so every single day, a different nest in a different place. So they invented sleeping nests, and they do keep them safe, but also they're very important because great apes are called great because they are big.
They are big, yes.
And in sleeping in trees, the sleeping nest provides stability and a basis, a platform on which to sleep so that they don't fall and go splat.
But by
It's
the
a
way, I'm really curious, how do monkeys sleep on the trees without this sleeping nest? I had
they,
never
they,
asked this question before,
they
but
drape themselves over branches, or
okay.
they'll lean up against, main stem of the tree or in a crook of a tree, but they do not build a nest. So that was invented by great apes. And there are primatologists that have studied, the architecture of tree nests. They've reverse engineered them. They climb up and get into them. And these are sophisticated tools. They're stationary tools. They don't go anywhere, but they require weaving together. You need a platform, a secure platform, and you weave together a big bowl and bring down branches with leaves, and then maybe get extra leaves and pad them in. And so these were perhaps the first invention at the basis of the hominid lineage, and very, very important for reasons of keeping secure and not falling and ending up out of the gene pool.
Yes, and because I mean I've spoken with Tim Coulson. He's a biologist, heads the biology department at Oxford, and we did a kind of mega view, from the origin of life to Homo sapiens. And the one thing that he said about, I mean, he's a couple of things, but the one big thing about primates was that primates were able to take this niche of living in the trees, where they really didn't have very many predators. And so, in a sense, what the great apes were able to do, I guess, then is to keep doing that while being really big.
Yes.
And the way they were able to do that was by this invention of
Yes.
creating these beds. Is that right?
Right. And they weave them. I mean, they weave the stems and the branches in and out. So sort of the first weaving, and eventually, perhaps partly to do with the reduction of the tree cover, eventually our earliest hominids, the earliest hominid ancestors, started to spend more time on the ground. Now, great apes will spend some time on the ground during the day, but they spend at least, a lot of hours, maybe 12 hours a day, arboreally sleeping. And then during the day, they'll also go in the trees and move. But our predecessors, earliest hominids, eventually started spending more time on the ground and eventually started making their sleeping nests on the ground. And that was an important part of
And
hominid.
besides the sleepiness, there's another botanic tool that, if we assume this pretty reasonable guess that what chimps do nowadays, probably our common ancestors was either doing or at least capable of
Yes.
doing. Another thing that I was not aware of is that they actually have been seen to hunt with spears.
Yes.
That's pretty intense.
Yes. And they're chimpanzees that live in the savannah in Senegal. And it's females that do this. And they will take a stick, sharpen the end of it, and find trees that have holes in the trees, which is where a little non-human primate called the lesser bush baby or galago will sleep during the day.
The lesser bush baby is quite a name for an animal.
Yes, well, small. There are other bush babies, but this is a small one.
I think that if, like, say, I don't know, like the Komodo dragon is up there as like the most ferocious animal name you can imagine, the lesser bush baby is pretty far at the other extreme.
Right.
But anyway, okay. So okay, you mentioned an important difference there. The beds, that's something that all
Right.
great apes do every single day. Every great
Right.
ape will do this. The spears is a much more. We've seen it in this one interesting place, but it would be remarkable if during the 3 million years leading to the first stone tools there was no one making a spear.
Yes.
Given that even chimpanzees nowadays do sometimes make spears.
Yeah, I think we can assume that. Yeah. So with the transition to the ground with bipedalism, it changed the form of the body, of course, as hominid bodies became adapted for bipedalism. And one of the most important things that happened is that the big toes, rather than being in an ape-like position sticking out to the side, and our ancestors eventually moved in and became aligned with the rest of the foot.
It's really remarkable. I remember seeing a photo of a chimpanzee foot from the below, like to from the sole of the feet.
Yeah.
And I first thought I was looking at a hand.
Yes.
It looks much more like a human hand than it looks like a human foot, because of the way that the big toe is like a grabbing thumb.
Right. And we've lost that. And with that, we've lost the ability to use our feet like hands. Our feet are weight-bearing instruments. And so something very important happened, and I think very early, which is that infants with selection for bipedalism, infants' feet also had toes that were like this, and they lost an ability, or they ceased to develop an ability that all great ape infants develop within the first couple of months of their lives, and all monkey infants develop, which is the ability to use hands and feet to hang on to their mothers. When they're really tiny, they hang on to in the belly region. And so the mom can go about her business on the ground and in the trees and not worry about the baby falling off. And hominid infants with bipedalism eventually lost that grasping ability with the feet and would have been in mortal danger of falling off and dying. And I think that probably happened. It probably happened a lot. And it was a pretty intense selective pressure. So, with bipedalism, which I view as having developed over a long time, I do not think one day they're arboreal and the next day, ta da, we're habitual
Yeah.
bipeds. Early on, when infants lost this ability, they would have begun, as the ability was lost, as bipedalism was starting to evolve, they would have lost the ability to hang on to their mothers. They would have been in danger of falling, and no primate infant likes to fall off of its mother. Human primate infants really would rather that you hold them than put them down. So the mother had a problem too, which is she had to go about her business, which would have been foraging for food. And her infant would, there would have come a time in evolution where infants would have been very insecure in terms of hanging on to her. So she had a problem, which is how do I do what I have to do if I have to carry this baby in my arm or this infant in my arms? And I think that probably this sparked the maybe the first post sleeping nest invention, which would have been taking that idea of the sleeping nest, which was ingrained cognitively in great apes and in our ancestors, and having this little epiphany that, well, if my baby, I don't want my baby infant to fall off, I could just make a sleeping nest and wear it. In other words, I can take those ingrained weaving of botanical material, vines and branches, and make a little sleeping nest that I wear on my body and put my infant in. So I think baby slings, and others have suggested this before me, by the way. Adrian Zellman, for instance, a long time ago suggested that baby slings may have been the first or among the very first inventions of hominids. And I think that cognitively, they were just a logical extension of the ability to weave arboreal tree nests.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
and I mean, it's fair to say that because it's the fossil record is so quiet on this
Mhm.
early days
Yeah,
that it's very anything we say is going to be, it's going to be somewhat speculative. But I think and but when I first heard that baby slings might have been the um, first kind of tool or invention, in the hominin lineage, I was like, okay, yeah, maybe they could have, but like they could have equally
yeah,
well not, like who knows. But it's really when I do think that the argument is really strong in that weaving something where you and your baby can sleep in or sleep on is a great ape invention. That it
yes,
does become almost, then it almost, I think the odds do change in a way that it would actually be quite remarkable if you then move to the ground, start having problems, and you don't ever do anything similar, like create a little nest for your child and then realize you can also carry that nest and then maybe make it a bit easier to
right.
carry, etc. So it does, I do think that the odds, having understood how broad and wide this behavior is in great apes, it did change the odds in my mind to be more favorable to
Yeah,
that suggestion. There is an interesting link between that and some of your earlier work. So, I mean, one of the things I think if people have just heard about Dean Falk, they might have heard about the putting the baby down
right.
hypothesis. What's the putting the baby down hypothesis, very briefly, and how do you think this changes things or complements things?
Yeah. That hypothesis is at least 20 years old. And initially, I thought when I proposed it that hominid mothers foraging for food would have had a problem because they would have had to carry their babies because the babies couldn't hang on anymore. And so that they would travel, they would go hunt for food. And when they found a place where there were resources, they would put their baby down next to them. Don't put it down and leave, or you won't have a baby. You may not have a baby to come back to. And that babies and non-human primate babies hate this, human primates babies hate it. Babies would not be happy being put down, and that they would indicate their displeasure vocally. And in other animals, there are contact calls if they should become separated, the infants and mothers. The infants will make a contact call and the mothers will do it back. So that's a normal thing to do.
Okay.
I think it became very extended in our ancestors, and that infants would signal their displeasure emotionally, vocally. They evolved an ability to cry real tears that are wet, that mothers would have done what we do, which is if a baby's unhappy, one tries to soothe it by, "Shh, they're there, it's okay." So I think it opened up a channel of reciprocal vocal and gestural eye contact, facial expressions, interactions that were conversational between mothers and infants. And that over a lot of time, way, way more recently, those kinds of vocal interactions evolved into, I'll call it proto-motherese, or the first baby talk. Lullabies, humming, singing, and baby talk, way more recently.
And I guess needless to say, but I guess at the end of the day, language.
Right, exactly. It's a forerunner over lots and lots of millions of years.
It's a good point you made there about it's easy to, when describing these things, say, well, first the babies have the capacity to cling, then they lose the capacity to cling.
Yeah.
But of course, you have like, what, 1,000,000 or 2,000,000 years where they don't lose the capacity, they still cling, but they just start falling more and more.
Yeah. And it can be, and there's work from Goodall, from chimps, it can be absolutely deadly for babies to fall off, for little infants. It can kill them. It can be an intense selective agent that's falling off. So I think it did happen. I think it happened over a long period of time. And that one of the things that happened as a result of that was it changed the dynamics of mother-infant interactions, including communications. But another thing, and this isn't in the book so much, it's work that's in press. It'll be out in April with somebody named Mats Larsson from Sweden, is that he was looking at thinking about gestating early hominids and thinking about the origins of music. And he came up with this idea that I thought was so nifty. So I contacted him and we started to collaborate. And what his idea was that if you're a gestating early hominid woman and you're in the process, your species is in the process of becoming bipedal, and you are more and more, you and your descendants are more and more bipedal more of the time, that the gestating infant hears the bipedal steps of its mothers, which are pretty rhythmic and regular. You can go at different speeds, but by and large, you would hear this, but also it would feel it sloshing around in the amniotic fluid. And that as a result, the nervous system evolved, according to Larson, so that it synthesized what's heard rhythmically with what's felt. And
Yes.
yeah, he saw this as the origin of a unique among primates abilities that humans have. There's some other animals that have it, but within primates, it's unique. And that is the ability to keep time to an external rhythmic sound, keep a beat to music.
Yes.
Dance to
Yes.
music.
Yes. Because the walking on all fours, you don't create a rhythmic pattern, or you
Right.
have to be a real jazz drummer to detect the rhythmic pattern in that.
And so Larson saw this at the origins of music skills, the likely beginning, feeding. He's not saying back then, 6.5 million years ago, that hominids were making music. He's saying that their nervous systems changed as they were gestating, and that later was taken advantage of by natural selection, aka exapted, when later musical abilities, human-like musical abilities evolved. So when we started to collaborate, I said, but wait a minute, this entrainment, as it's called, keeping a beat to, and you can entrain to visual things too, but keeping a beat to sound is also important for language because you can't have a conversation unless you are keeping track of the rhythm of your conversant, the person you're conversing with. And this would be true for mothers and infants too. So in reciprocal vocal communications, being able to keep track of that rhythm and know when to interject and keep beat to it is important. So we see, and what we have coming out in April is a paper seeing bipedalism as very important for the emergence of this unique among primates ability to keep a beat to sound. And we argue that, no, they're not dancing then, they don't have language then, but this ability was something that came forward in time and eventually was incorporated into the temporal arts and language.
And there's a fascinating speculation around that. I noticed that the average step speed is roughly 120 steps per minute, which is a very, very common beat
Yes,
in music,
exactly.
and which is very, very different than the average heartbeat. Because one of the theories of where beat comes from is that the baby hears the heartbeat when gestating, but that has two problems. One, well, it has one big problem, which is that the apes would also have that, the other apes would also
Exactly.
have that. And this is a more
Exactly.
speculative, I think,
Yeah.
fun addition of, oh,
Yeah.
by the way, it's
Yeah.
also quite funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
Most of our music goes to the average step
Yes.
of the average walking in this story, the walking mother.
Yeah.
Obviously, quite speculative, but these are fascinating ideas. When it comes to the origin of language, um, I'm sure that there are people who are gonna push back on this suggestion and say that this misses the core element of language. And I mean, I think that at the end of the day, any explanation of, say, the origin of language has to have a lot of components, and this can be
Right.
one of the components. But what
Right.
do you think when it comes to things like motherese, parentese, baby talk, whatever? I think that has a massive, massive benefit over every single other theory on the origin of language, which is that, let's say that language evolved for hunting or something. Well, how that you can't teach a 15-year-old or a 5-year-old to speak suddenly. Babies learn to speak
Right.
in humans, not
Right.
not not. So we learn to speak way before we hunt. Therefore, I think that this motherese
Exactly.
it has an obvious advantage in that almost any theory has to have the developmental story of why did the language become relevant so early on that it became possible to learn it in the way that we do. But I think that then the problem with that is that there are people in the kind of tradition of Noam Chomsky who don't see language as primarily about communication, because other animals can
Right.
communicate. They don't see language primarily as we can have a word for an object. Okay, that's cool, but you can teach this kind of symbols to other animals. But what's really remarkable, Chomsky and others would say, is grammar.
Yes.
Grammar is completely different from anything you see in other parts of the animal kingdom, and so we really have to explain grammar. And I'm sure that there are many people there who say that motherese or no motherese doesn't take us one step closer to explaining grammar, which is this
Right.
capacity of putting these symbols together in new
Right.
ways to create an infinite amount of
Yes.
expressions. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you can address that question by watching a human baby grow up. And first of all, it's been demonstrated time and time again that exposure to motherese facilitates language acquisition in babies. So, this idea that, oh, you don't want to talk down to your baby is actually bad advice. You do want to ooze motherese at babies. This is universal because subconsciously, parents with the motherese are actually teaching very important elements of language to the baby. And they learn where one word stops and another begins, that kind of thing. But if you watch development of humans, There will be there's a development. Initially, you have emotional reinforcement and bonding, expression of love on the part of the parents to the infant. Eventually, the cries are evolving into babbles, and the babbles sound very much like elements, like phonemes of speech. And there comes that wonderful stage where infants, maybe 9 months to a year old, are babbling, and it sounds so much like language, but it's nonsense. They don't have the words and the semantics yet, but they sure get the intonation and the rhythm and the parts. And then later, the epiphany where they realize that a sound means something specific. Grammar comes in 2.5 years old. They start to get the grammar. Oh, it's sequential. The development in humans is sequential and layered, and there's no reason to assume it was anything other than that during the course of, the emergence of the seeds that eventually led to language, and then selection from language itself. Eventually, you had words, and they started to be shared. Who knows at what point words started to get strung together into brief phrases and sentences, and so on. So I think that you can learn a lot by looking at the development of human beings growing up.
By the way, should I
And
have asked you before? I don't
go
know
ahead.
if I should have. Should I have asked you about how baby slings relate to putting the baby down? Because I mean, in a kind of cartoon fashion, if you have the baby sling, you don't have to put the baby down anymore. Is that something that's an interesting part of the story, or should we just?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it putting the baby down anymore. I would call it picking the baby up. Baby slings are universal, and what they're like varies with climate. But everywhere, people will take them off and put the baby sling down with the baby in it, or the cradle down with the cradle in it.
Yeah, yeah. So you still do put the baby down
Oh yeah,
sometimes.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. Okay. Well, uh, let's I mean, what I think is really fun about this, looking at the big toe, for example, is that there is a cliche that when we walk upright, we have freed our hands. I think it's
Yes,
probably true. We can make more things and carry more things with our hands when we're walking
absolutely.
upright. But what's lost in that story is that we also we imprison our feet,
That's right.
and we can't anymore do things with that. And so I think it's really it's a great and important part of the story is to look at bipedalism not just as freeing the hands but also imprisoning the feet. But let's look at the freeing of the hands now, or tool making more generally. I think one thing that's really interesting is that there's been this long idea. Let's say since Darwin, he speculated, but in a very reasonable way, that there's been a kind of virtuous cycle where when you become bipedal or more bipedal, you free your hands.
Mm-hmm.
You can make more tools.
Mm-hmm.
With the making of those tools, you can maybe access more foods better. Being smarter becomes more important, and that then feeds into brain growth. And then the better brain you are, then the more you can use these tools, and
Right.
it becomes a virtuous cycle.
Right.
And that there was a time when this was seen to be okay. Well, that's just not the case. We walked upright. Now we know way before you get brain enlargement, and way before you get these stone tool cultures. So it's not a virtuous cycle. But then we can say, hold on a second. Darwin said that when we start walking upright, we can use tools more.
Yes.
Well, as you point out, it's not only stone tools that means. It
Right.
might very well have been that as we that the stone that increased tool usage did start much earlier, around the time when we started walking upright more. And then this refers to another part of your work. So I mean, you seem to be the person to ask to analyze new hominin brains based on the skulls, and reading through that literature, I've seen that that even before we start seeing brain growth, there are these hominin species around towards the end of the Botanic Age, who have, especially, am I right, Australopithecine africanus,
Yep.
who has interesting changes in
Sure.
how their brains are
Yeah.
organized, not the size, but the organization of the brain.
Yes.
And so what the Darwin, if we would bring him to the room now, might say after having read your book, for example, is that I was right all along. Look, these creatures, they start walking upright. They probably were using much more tools, spears, digging sticks, whatever. We don't have them because they were made of botanic materials. And by the way, this is the time when we start seeing interesting changes in the brain. We didn't
Right.
notice them when we were just looking at the brain's size, but we do see it in the organization. So do you think that there is a way in which actually Darwin might have been much more right than he was given credit for during the past, I don't
Yeah.
know, 50 years or so?
Well, he was amazing. He actually got so much right without much of a fossil record. I mean, there
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
Neanderthal
yeah.
uh, yes. Well, let me begin by saying that you mentioned something, and it's the assumption that we have, and it's just ingrained in the field, that brain size evolution all happened in the Stone Age. And you'll find people saying, oh, with Homo erectus, there was, around 2 million, you have that. I'm a little skeptical of those things because we're sampling such small amounts of the record. But what I want to say is that before the Stone Age, from 6.5 up to, let's say, 3.5, we have no idea about brain size. You might, in hominids that I think were on the lineage, could be entertained as having been on the lineage leading humans. We don't know. 6.5, maybe they had monkey-sized brains, and there was an acceleration during that period. We don't know. We don't have the fossil record to address that, but there's this ingrained assumption that, oh, it all happened, in the Stone Age. So that's the first thing. In terms of your questions about shape, yes, Australopithecines are the lineage that is thought to have at some point, some Australopithecines somewhere in Africa gave rise to the genus Homo. Australopithecine brains are roughly ape size, let's just say, a third or a fourth the size of modern human, maybe as big as my fist. But in the shape of Australopithecine brains, the study you're referring to, I did it with some colleagues in 2000.
Yeah,
We,
exactly.
we looked at the overall shape of the endocast of Australopithecus africanus and compared it to those from another genus, Paranthropus, so-called robust Australopithecines. Now, Paranthropus is not thought to have given rise directly to the genus Homo, but it's a really interesting critter. I wish we had a whole skeleton of Paranthropus. That's my top of my wish list. But if you look at the shapes of the endocast, we don't see, first of all, the cerebral cortex does not reproduce that well, that we have a good feel for all of the convolutions of the brain or the grooves that separate them. But you can look at general shape features. And when you do that, you see that in Australopithecus, there are some expansions which are derived that you don't see in Paranthropus. And they are things that we see in us. For instance, the back part of the brain projects further back than the cerebellum, which is tucked in under it.
Okay.
So having a backward projected occipital lobe is a derived feature. You see that in early hominids, but not Paranthropus. There are features to do with the frontal lobes at the side where they're expanded out. The bottom surface of the frontal lobe is expanded. Again, that is a derived feature. So and there's temporal lobes expansion in a certain place, and that's derived. So you see shape changes that suggests there's something going on in the brain. We call that reorganization, changes of the internal wiring or neurochemistry, and that those kinds of changes may well have preceded them being manifested on the surface of the brain.
So by the time you can actually see from a broken skull that the brain has started reorganizing, it
It's,
probably has a long history of having some of
yes,
that reorganization.
yeah.
Yes, that's a good
And
point. Yeah.
I think, the brain started going in whatever, bumbling down the path it eventually went down at the separation from chimpanzees. So there would have been a long period where hominids were adapting to new environments, were evolving, were inventing new botanic inventions, and that the brain, of course, would have been involved. Brains are still evolving. So I don't think there was this stasis for 3
Yeah.
million years where nothing happened.
So the Darwinian virtuous cycle between bipedalism, tool use, and brain size increase or brain organization change, whatever, that possibility is at least on the table.
Absolutely. In fact, how could there not be?
Okay, yeah, that's
Seriously.
great. That's great. Okay,
Seriously.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it makes
yeah,
total sense.
yeah. Wonderful. Let's start approaching the end, but before that, a couple of questions. One is that if we quickly then forget all the details and then just look at the fact that, well, the human brain has grown massively in our evolution. We talked earlier about what various things that might have made it a useful thing, but of course you can't grow a brain if you can't grow a brain. Just because it's useful doesn't mean you're going to grow it. You need energy. And as your early work pointed out, you also need a cooling system, right?
Right.
The brain can only be as big as it can be cooled down.
Exactly.
So 2 questions. Feel free to answer them very briefly. Let's take the cooling first. This was a long, long time ago that you suggested that there's something happened when humans stood upright, where in one branch of the Australopithecines, you happen to kind of have a good cooling system ready. Is that a good paraphrasing of the radiator theory? And where does the theory stand at the moment?
Okay. So the theory was that with bipedalism, gravity acted on columns of fluid, and that if you stand those columns of fluid, meaning your blood vessels, in a vertical position, gravity is going to act on it in a particular way that's different from when your column of fluid is this way. When your column of fluid is this way, gravity acts uniformly along it. So the theory is that there was replumbing of the vascular, of the veins, in response to being upright. And that a side thing, benefit of this is that there are a lot of little veins that penetrate the skull that are part of a really huge vascular network, and that these veins could, under certain circumstances, where it's very, very hot and the individual is heat stressed. Say you're a runner, you work out, or you're working out in the gym, you become flushed. Your face actually might get red. And what's happening is your vessels are dilating at the surface. You're sweating, so you're perspiring, and that's cooling the blood at the surface. And that under those circumstances, and only under those circumstances, the direction of blood flow actually reverses into the skull, and you're bringing cool surface blood into the cranium, which is helping to keep the temperature reasonable of the brain. So that would be the radiator. It's a network of blood vessels that evolved with bipedalism. It was theoretical based on holes in skulls, Australopithecines and apes and hominids, until about 1996, when an anatomist named Zenker actually demonstrated it anatomically. It does exist. It had been controversial whether or not humans could, quote, selectively cool the brain. He demonstrated the anatomical basis with gorgeous illustrations. And so I would say that it's been fairly broadly accepted, and thermal regulation of the brain is super important. It will be super important for any animal.
And so in a way we lucked out, because even if the chimpanzee line would have quote unquote wanted to grow big brains, they might have bumped into a heating problem.
Yeah, and a lot of it's serendipitous. I think a lot of hominid evolution, it's not been linear in a conceived direction. It's sort of evolution just bumbled down the road, and through pure dumb luck, certain things happened. And that's was sort of like, well, with upright posture, this happened. And since then too, there's a study that shows when human infants are very young, they're more likely to have this other channel, which you see in like parenthesis specimens, but they lose it because as they develop bipedalism around age 2, well, then that channel ceases to be important or to be as big, and it gets supplanted
And
by,
that other channel wouldn't be a good cooling
yeah,
channel.
yeah. And so that's more kind of corroborating
Interesting,
recent
interesting.
study. Yeah.
Well, the other thing you need, and this is kind of the radiator theory is really original contribution from you. Now, this is much more general, which kind of everyone who thinks about brain growth thinks about how were we able to feed it. Brain takes so much energy. The classic, I don't know how if it's true, but roughly 2% of the body size, but takes roughly 20% of the whole energy. So there has to have been an energy source, an increased energy source, or something in the energy system must have been, whether it was fire, whether it was grinding food with stone tools, whether it was bone marrow, oysters, who knows what. What's your favorite take on
Oysters. Oysters fried with lemon. I'm a the expansive tissue hypothesis. First of all, I want to know, where does that statistic come from that our brains take 20% of our calories? I've tried to run it down. Everybody quotes that. Oh, expensive tissue. Where does that come from? But let's stipulate that it's true. Then you're starting to think about big game hunting, and then you're getting into Homo erectus. And that's pretty recent in the greater scheme of things. But these were important innovations. I mean, cooking does help break down the food and makes it taste better too. So those things would have been important. I'm not sure they were decisive. Not that these other things weren't important. They may have been. I just think going that recently and, down to meat eating or to cooking is a little narrow. But that's all hunch. I can't prove it. I can't give you.
Fair enough. Well, I think that's a good place to come to a close. So my final question always is, how has your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
Oh, well, it's not that research so much, but being an anthropologist and thinking about bipedalism, I think a thing that distinguishes us and a thing that went along with becoming terrestrial, with regrouping of social organizations into bigger ones, often multi-male, multi-female, where safety is important on the ground, and that there was a social innovation, which is dominance hierarchies. And they were adaptive because if you have dominance hierarchies, and initially they were conceived of as being in males, you have protection for the group. You're keeping order over competition for resources, including available mates, that kinds of things. So I think of our species as in love with alpha males, in love with dominance hierarchies, not at a conscious level. And I think we come by it rightly in that sense. But I'm a little horrified at some of the outcomes. I won't get into politics here, and so that's sort of my view of humanity. Is that we're a terrestrial species who's overrunning the planet, really into dominance hierarchies. We're seeing that in the world now. And that it might not have such a good outcome because of that, sadly. So I'm sorry, that's rather pessimistic. But I would say, as an anthropologist, I've already told you, I think, being able to express an infinite number of ideas sets us apart. And that's key in terms of what I think drove the hominid brain evolution. But in terms of our species, what sets us apart and what may do us in is the being enamored of alpha males, no matter how horrible they are.
Well, Dean Falk, thank you so much for your great research and your really generous and inspiring time today.
Okay, well, thank you. My pleasure.
So that was it. That was episode 2 on the origins of humankind. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. And stay tuned for next week's episode 3 with the iconic anthropologist Chris Stringer. So hit the subscribe button and head to onhumans.substack.com/origins to access more essential material on the story that made us who we are. Until next time, take care.